Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're exploring some of the most fascinating tales in all of Greek mythology, the stories of mortals who crossed the line between humanity and divinity. These are men and women who caught the attention of the gods, earned their favor, or sometimes defied them, only to be transformed forever. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to drift into sleep or simply enjoy a quiet moment in the company of old stories, I'm glad you're with me. Now, let's begin. The summer air over Thebes hung heavy, clinging to skin like a damp cloth. Down in the palace gardens, Semele walked between the olive trees, the hem of her violet dress whispering against the dust. She was a princess, the daughter of Cadmus and Harmonia, but she carried herself differently from her sisters. While they preened for mortal kings, she had eyes for something higher, something dangerous. Whispers had already begun in the streets, that the king of the gods himself had noticed her, that lightning had bent its path to the earth because of her beauty. The first time Zeus came to her, it was not in a thunderclap. He arrived like a storm that had been waiting for the right moment to break. Slow, patient, deliberate. A man in shape, but with the kind of presence that made you feel as though the air had thinned. He didn't need to say who he was. You knew. Semele should have feared him. Instead, she felt the strange warmth of his attention like sunlight after a long winter. She didn't flinch when he reached for her hand. Their meetings became a secret ritual. No one saw him enter her chamber at night, but by morning the silken air still carried the faint smell of rain and ozone. She began to believe she was untouchable, favored above all mortals. But favor from Olympus is never simple, and somewhere far above, a goddess was watching. Hera had endured these affairs before, nymphs, queens, shepherd girls, but this one stung. Semele wasn't just another passing distraction for Zeus. He visited her often, lingered, gave her promises in the quiet dark. Hera didn't just want her gone, she wanted her burned out of existence. The queen of the gods chose not to strike openly. Instead, she came in disguise. An old woman with the stooped back of a palace nurse, the kind of figure who could slip through corridors unnoticed. Semele, trusting, let her in. Hera's voice was soft, the tone of a confidant who knew more than she should. And then the seed of poison was planted. How do you know it's truly Zeus? Men claim to be gods all the time. The question took root. All afternoon it gnawed at her. By evening, it was an ache she couldn't ignore. When Zeus returned, she tried to mask her doubt, but it came out sharp and desperate. She asked him to prove himself, to come to her not as a man, but in the full splendor of the god who ruled the skies. She spoke like someone reaching for the truth, but Zeus heard the words with a tightening jaw. He knew no mortal could bear it. Yet he had sworn an oath by the river Styx to give her whatever she desired, and the oath of a god is iron. The air began to change before her eyes. Shadows clung to the corners of the room. The scent of rain swelled until it choked her. Then the first crack of lightning split the air, so close she could feel the heat. Zeus's form began to blaze, light spilling from his skin in jagged bursts. His voice deepened into something that was less a sound and more a force pressing into her bones. She saw the curve of a thunderbolt forming in his hand and the golden arcs that leapt from his eyes. For a heartbeat, she was entranced. The beauty was overwhelming, sharper than fear. and then the fire reached her. Heat roared across the chamber like a wave, searing flesh, devouring cloth. She tried to breathe, but the air itself was flame. The last thing she saw was a blinding white flash, the shape of Zeus collapsing into raw light, and then the world turned to ash. When the storm subsided, there was nothing left of Semele but the faint curl of smoke rising into the rafters. In the stillness that followed, Zeus stood among the ruin, grief heavy in his chest. From the ashes, he gathered the smallest, most fragile thing, the child she had been carrying. Still too young for the world, the god placed the infant inside his own thigh, the only womb that could finish what she had begun. Semele's mortal life had ended in an instant. Her beauty and ambition burned away by the very power she had sought. But her son, the child of fire and God, would live. And somewhere deep in the shadow of Olympus, Hera's satisfaction was cold and absolute. The underworld was not a place mortals left. That was the rule, as old as the first death. Once you crossed its threshold, you were the property of shadow and silence, and no god, not even the king of Olympus, made a habit of defying that. But Dionysus wasn't like other gods. He had grown with the knowledge that his mother had died because of him, or at least because she had carried him. Hera's hand was in it, yes, but the moment she asked Zeus to reveal himself, the moment the lightning struck, was the moment her life ended and his began. He had been sown into Zeus's thigh like a seed into the earth, born twice, and yet half of him, the mortal half, had been left behind in the ashes of Thebes. Now he was a god, young but already wrapped in the strange contradictions of his nature, a bringer of joy and a sower of madness, a liberator and a destroyer. And there was something else, something almost human. He couldn't stop thinking about her. The stories others told of Semele were thin shadows of the woman she must have been. Dionysus wanted more. He wanted her alive. And so he went down. The entrance to Hades was a wound in the earth, deep in a place where no birds sang, and even the trees seemed to lean away from the darkness. Dionysus descended, the torches along the tunnel flickering at his passing. He moved through the mists of Lethe, the black banks of Cocytus, past the judges and their endless weighing of souls. The dead recognized him, not just as a god but as one of their own, for he carried the scent of mortality still. They whispered as he passed, voices dry as leaves. When he found her, Semele was not the bright princess from the stories. Death had hollowed her, made her quieter, paler. She wore the expression of someone who had long since accepted the weight of what had happened to her. But when she saw him, her eyes widened. Something, perhaps instinct, perhaps blood, told her exactly who he was. He told her why he had come. The words felt heavier than he expected, as if speaking them out loud might invite the Furies to descend on them both. But she only listened, one hand rising to touch his cheek, as though testing whether he was real. Hades didn't like parting with souls. That was the other rule. The underworld was a kingdom built on keeping what it took. But Dionysus was persuasive in ways even the Lord of the Dead couldn't fully resist. He offered gifts, rare things, strange things, and he promised debts to be called in later. And perhaps Hades, who knew the bitterness of family betrayals, saw something worth permitting in a son bringing back his mother. So it was agreed. The journey upward was slower than the descent. Semele's hand in his was warm for the first time in years, and with every step the air grew lighter. The colors returned, the green of moss, the gold of sunlight breaking through a cave mouth. She blinked against it, squinting as though the light itself might burn her again. They climbed into a different world. Dionysus didn't take her to Thebes. Thebes had been the stage for her death, and he would not have her step foot there again. Instead, he took her to the high halls of Olympus. It's one thing for a god to appear there unannounced. It's another to walk in leading a mortal by the hand. The Olympians turned at once. Some smiled, curious, but others, Hera especially, narrowed their eyes. She did not speak, but the look she gave Semele could have stripped stone to dust. Zeus rose from his throne. For a moment he simply stared at her, as though he wasn't sure she was more than an echo conjured by his own mind. Then he descended the steps and drew her close. Whatever guilt he carried for her death, and it was there, buried under layers of pride, softened his voice when he spoke her name. In front of the whole assembly, Zeus made his decision. Semele would not walk the earth again as a mortal. He would give her the gift that erased the fragility of flesh. The air thickened, humming with the power of the decree. Light gathered around her, not the wild, scorching light that had destroyed her before, but something gentler, as though it had been tamed for her alone. Her skin seemed to drink it in, her bones straightening, her eyes brightening. When it was over, she was no longer Semele, princess of Thebes. She was Thyone, goddess of the Bacchic rites, honored mother of Dionysus. The gods accepted her into their company, some more graciously than others. Hera's gaze lingered a heartbeat too long, and there was no mistaking the cold edge in it. But even Hera knew that what was done could not be undone. Dionysus watched her take her first steps as an immortal. He could already picture her at his side during his revels, crowned in ivy, wine-dark joy spilling into the world. No longer a ghost, no longer a cautionary tale whispered in palace halls. She had become part of the eternal story of Olympus. And if, in quiet moments, she still remembered the heat and the flash, and the moment her breath was torn from her, she never spoke of it. She had been burned once by the glory of a god. Now she would live among them, untouchable. It began, as these things often do, quietly. Ino didn't notice the curse at first. There was no sudden storm over the palace, no lightning striking the city walls, no whisper in her ear that her days as a queen would soon be counted in single digits. Life in Thebes moved on. The market thrummed with merchants shouting their prices. The temple bells rang in the morning, and in the courtyard, her sons chased each other between the pillars while Athena sat in council. But there were signs, if she had been willing to see them. A shadow in the way the servants lowered their eyes, a strange, cold draft that slipped under the palace doors even on warm days, a tension in Athana's jaw when she spoke the name Dionysus. She had taken the boy god in without hesitation. How could she not? He was the child of her sister, her blood, abandoned to the jealousy of a goddess who never forgave an insult. She had nursed him herself for a time, hummed lullabies to him when he woke screaming in the night. And though she told herself she was acting out of duty, the truth was simpler. She loved him. That love had been enough to blind her to the danger. She knew Hera's reach was long. She knew it was only a matter of time before the queen of the gods turned her attention to Thebes. Still, she hoped, foolishly, that Hera might let this one thing pass. The hope shattered one late afternoon when the sun hung low and coppery over the city. She was in the courtyard with Melicertes, watching him toddle across the tiles, when Athamas appeared in the doorway. His face was blank in a way that made her stomach lurch. His eyes moved slowly, not with thought, but with something colder, like the tracking of an animal. He called for their older son, Lurcus, his voice strangely flat. The boy came running, laughing, and for one perfect moment, everything seemed almost normal. Then Athamas's hands closed around him. It happened too fast for sense. One moment the boy was looking up at his father. The next, Athamas was lifting him as though he were no heavier than a lamb. And then, the crack. The sound was sharp, final. The breath went out of Lurcus, and he folded to the stones like cloth dropped from a great height. The courtyard went silent, except for Melicertes' startled cry and the faint hiss of the fountain in the corner. Ino felt her body lock, her hands frozen at her sides, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were telling her. When she could move again, it was because Athamas was looking at her now, really looking. And there was no love in his gaze, no recognition, just the slow, deliberate hunger of madness, the kind Hera was known to feed. His steps toward her were measured, like a predator drawing out the moment before the pounce. Melicertes began to wail, and the sound snapped Ino into motion. She grabbed the boy and ran. Through the palace halls, her slippers sliding on the polished floor, the echo of her steps doubled by the heavier tread behind her. Down the wide stairs where the light from the windows fell in white slabs, making the dust in the air glow. Melicertes' small hands clutched at her dress, his cries ragged and breathless. She could hear Athamas' voice behind her now, but the words were nonsense. Snarled fragments of threats and prayers, broken open by laughter that had nothing human in it. She burst out into the streets of Thebes. The market was still full. People pressed shoulder to shoulder around the stalls, but they parted when they saw her face. They didn't ask questions. The queen was running with the youngest prince in her arms, her hair loose, her eyes wide, and behind her came the king, his mouth open in a soundless shout. Vendors pulled their carts aside without thinking. Children flattened themselves against walls. The smell of figs and baking bread mixed with the stench of fear, sharp and metallic in her mouth. The city fell away faster than she realized. She didn't remember turning down certain streets or cutting through the olive grove. But the next thing she knew, the ground beneath her was thinning, giving way to pale rock and wild grass. And ahead, the cliff rose like the edge of the world. The sea spread out beyond it, endless and grey-blue under a bruised sky. The wind was stronger here, slamming into her face, tangling her hair into ropes. She stopped at the cliff's edge. Her breath came in ragged pulls. Melicertes was sobbing against her neck, his small body hot with fear. She turned her head just enough to see Athamas emerging from the grass behind her, moving slowly now, as though savoring the end. His hands were open, palms up, a grotesque parody of welcome. She knew what he meant to do. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. There would be no mercy. If he got close enough, he would tear Melicertes from her arms, and the boy's life would end as his brother's had. Sudden, senseless, and without even the dignity of a goodbye. The choice crystallized in her mind with brutal clarity. The land behind her was death. The sea below was unknown, but unknown was better than certain. She pressed her lips to Melicertes' hair and inhaled. One last breath of the life they had known. He smelled of sun and milk and the faint sweetness of honey bread from that morning's breakfast. She whispered his name, barely a thread of sound against the wind, and then she stepped forward. The drop swallowed them. The rush of air roared in her ears, stealing the scream from her throat before it could form. Salt spray stung her face, and Melicertes clung to her, his fists tangled in her hair. The cliff face blurred past, white stone, black streaks of wetness, the quick dart of a gull. Below, the sea rose fast, the surface shattering into white teeth where it met the rocks. She braced for the crush, the breaking of bone and breath. It didn't come. The water caught them, but not like water should. It wasn't the brutal slap of a wave against skin. It was a slow, deliberate closing of hands around them, strong enough to stop their fall, but gentle enough not to break them. The cold was sharp, but clean, like the first gulp of air after running too far. They sank just enough for the roar of the cliffside to fade, and in the muffled quiet, she realized they were not drowning. The sea was holding them. Somewhere beneath her feet, something vast moved, not the churn of the tide, but a living thing. She felt it before she saw it, a low hum through the water that settled deep in her chest, matching the frantic beat of her heart until the two rhythms were the same. Melicertes stopped crying. His wide eyes were fixed on the darkness below, and for a moment, Ino thought she saw a pale shape rising toward them, something with the long hair and streaming arms of a woman, but taller than any mortal. The sea did not let them go. The shapes beneath the water moved closer. At first, Ino thought they were just tricks of light, the way sunlight bent and fractured as it cut through the waves. But no, the light was wrong. It didn't ripple or break apart. It streamed toward her in deliberate lines, gleaming threads of silver and green, pulling themselves upward from the deep. The hum she had felt in her chest grew louder, almost a vibration now, and she realized it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from them. The first face emerged, a woman's, pale as the moon on snow, framed in long hair that drifted and coiled like kelp. Her eyes were the color of pearl, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. She didn't swim in the way mortals swam. She simply moved through the water, as if the sea was a cloak she could slip between folds of. More figures followed, some human-shaped, others stranger, their arms tapering into fins, their bodies scaled in shimmering plates, the Nereids, daughters of the sea. Ino should have been afraid, but the cold that had gripped her spine since the cliff was gone, replaced by a steady warmth that radiated from the hands still holding her and Melicertes. She looked down and saw one of the Nereids cradling her son, her long fingers gentle on his small back, her expression one of quiet approval, as if she had been waiting for this child. And then the water shifted again, darker now, heavier, as if the sea itself had decided to draw closer. A shadow rolled upward from the abyss, so vast it blocked the light. When it came into focus, it was a man. No, not a man, a god. The sea clung to him like armor, wreathing his shoulders in foam, his hair streaming in ropes the color of storm clouds. A crown of coral sat on his brow, and in his hand he carried a trident that seemed older than the world. Poseidon. His gaze swept over Ino, not with the quick judgment of men, but with the slow, inexorable weight of a tide deciding whether to swallow or spare. She felt herself laid bare under it. Her life, her choices, her leap from the cliff, all of it measured and weighed in a heartbeat that seemed to last forever. Melicertes reached out one tiny hand toward him, unafraid. Poseidon's mouth curved, the faintest suggestion of a smile, and the water around them softened, as if the whole sea had sighed. Ino opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Words seemed useless here. Whatever case she might have made, that she was a mother protecting her child, that Hera's cruelty had left her no choice, Poseidon already knew. He turned his head slightly, and the Nereids began to move, guiding Ino and Melicertes deeper. The light dimmed as they descended, the surface closing above like the lid of a chest, shutting out the mortal world. In its place, new lights bloomed, slow swells of bioluminescence from corals and sea flowers, fish that glowed like drifting embers. The water pressed in, not with weight but with presence, surrounding them so completely that the idea of air, of land, of anything not water, began to feel unreal. They came to a palace that wasn't built so much as grown. Towers of coral, twisting into shapes no mortal architect could conceive. Shells the size of chariots fitted into walls, pearl-studded gates swinging open without a sound. The floor was sand so white it gleamed, and the walls pulsed faintly with the rhythm of the tide. Ino was led to a great hall, and there Poseidon spoke for the first time, his voice like the undertow, deep, steady, impossible to resist. He told her that the sea had been watching since the moment her feet left the cliff, that in her leap, she had given herself over to it, not as a queen fleeing a king, but as a soul surrendering to something greater than fear. And the sea, he said, did not forget courage. The Nereids circled her and Melicertes. Their hands brushed over skin, leaving trails of warmth that seeped deep, changing something in her bones. Her heartbeat slowed, not from weakness, but because she no longer needed the frantic pace of mortal life. The salt water filled her lungs, but it didn't choke. It nourished, each breath cool and sweet, erasing the ache in her chest. Her vision sharpened. She could see each grain of sand on the floor, the exact pattern of light along a fish's scales. Her skin grew paler, touched with a faint shimmer like sunlight on water. The weight of the years she had lived, every grief, every sleepless night, slid away as easily as a shawl slipping from her shoulders. Melicertes laughed, the sound light and bubbling, as if the sea itself had found its way into his voice. His small form was changing too, his eyes taking on the deep green of kelp, his movements quick and smooth as a darting fish. Poseidon raised his trident, and the water thrummed with a force that made the walls of the palace shiver. He named her Leucothea, the white goddess, protector of sailors and bringer of safe harbors. Melicertes he named Palemon, the gentle guardian of ships, the child god who watches over those who dare the sea. Ino, no, Leucothea now, felt the words settle into her like anchors, not weighing her down, but holding her steady in a way she had never known. She understood, without being told, that she could never return to the life she had left on land. But neither she nor her son would ever be hunted again. They belonged here, in the deep. Their mortal story finished, and their divine one only beginning. When she emerged again toward the surface, it was not as a fugitive or a queen stripped of her crown. It was as a goddess rising from her throne, the sea parting for her, the wind carrying her name across the waves. Sailors would speak of her in hushed voices, tying offerings to the masts of their ships in hopes she might guide them through storms. And when a lone voyager was tossed into the sea, far from land, sometimes, just sometimes, he would feel a hand beneath him, lifting him toward the light. And if he opened his eyes in that moment, he might see a woman pale as moonlight, her hair drifting like seaweed, a small boy at her side, both smiling as though they had been waiting for him all along. The hills outside Troy were a place where the air seemed to breathe differently, lighter in the morning when the mist clung to the grass, heavy in the afternoon when the sun bled gold across the ridges. This was where Ganymede lived most of his days, moving among the sheep with the slow, unhurried grace of someone who had never been hunted, never been told that his life could be anything other than this. He was young, not yet 20, with the kind of beauty that pulled the eyes of strangers without him meaning to. It wasn't only his face, though that alone could unsettle even the most stone-hearted soldier, but the way he carried himself, as if he belonged in both the quiet of the pastures and in some place higher, some place no mortal ever reached. The people in Troy whispered about it sometimes. His beauty was a blessing, they said. His beauty was a curse, they said. His beauty would make him famous. His beauty would get him killed. They couldn't agree, but they all agreed on one thing. No one looked like Ganymede without the gods noticing eventually. That day began like any other. The sheep grazed lazily, the air humming with the drone of summer insects. Ganymede was leaning against a rock, half watching the flock, half lost in thoughts he couldn't quite catch when the wind shifted. It was nothing dramatic at first, just a sudden coolness, the faint smell of rain where there shouldn't have been any. Then came the shadow. It cut across the grass in a shape too sharp to be a cloud, moving far too quickly to be anything ordinary. He lifted his head. The sky was empty for a moment, an aching stretch of blue, and then it wasn't. The eagle appeared so suddenly, it was as though it had been painted into the sky in a single stroke. Its wings were vast, each beat a slow, deliberate push of air that rattled the leaves on the nearest trees. The sunlight caught the curve of its talons, each one curved and shining like molten gold, and its eyes, sharp, burning, locked onto him. There was no time to run. Even if he had thought to move, the ground felt too far away, the air too thick. The eagle descended, not with the erratic dive of a bird hunting prey, but with the precision of something that had chosen exactly what it wanted and would not leave without it. When it struck, the air burst around them. Its talons closed around his waist, not tearing, but gripping with an unshakable strength that told him there would be no escape. The ground fell away in a rush, the sheep scattering into white blurs below, the familiar shapes of the hills twisting into smaller and smaller folds of green. His breath caught, not from fear alone, but from the shock of the wind tearing past his face, the cold bite of the upper air. At first, he thought the bird was just that, a bird, monstrous in size, but still just a creature. Then he felt it. The pulse in its body was not the steady beat of a heart, but the deep, thrumming force of a storm. Lightning coiled somewhere inside it, and in the line of its jaw, in the glint of its eyes, he saw something he had never seen in any animal. Awareness. Will. They rose higher. The air thinned. The world stretched below into a flat sweep of color. Blue sea, dark forest, the faint white scars of cities on the land. The eagle tilted its head once, just enough for Ganymede to see the curve of a smile that wasn't a smile at all. And in that moment he knew. He was not in the claws of any ordinary eagle. He was in the grasp of Zeus. The realization struck harder than the wind. This was the king of the gods, ruler of the skies. And for reasons Ganymede could not begin to guess, Zeus had crossed the space between heaven and earth for him. His body felt caught between two truths. The human part of him that wanted to fight, to twist free, to get back to the ground, and the part that understood that no one refused Zeus and lived unchanged. Far below, Troy disappeared behind a wall of cloud. He thought briefly of his father, King Tros, who even now might be looking for him. He thought of the way the city looked at sunset, the towers glowing red, the smell of bread from the market, and then he thought of the eagle's grip, the steady, unyielding rhythm of its wings. The mortal world was falling away from him, and no matter how tightly he might hold onto it in his mind, it would not hold onto him. They broke through the last of the clouds, and the sky above was not the pale, fragile blue he knew. It was deep, endless, and so bright it felt alive. Somewhere far ahead, a light was gathering. Not the sun, but something stranger, richer, a light that felt like music. The eagle adjusted its wings, angling toward it. And in that moment, as the wind roared in his ears and the earth was nothing but a distant memory, Ganymede realized with a sudden, terrible clarity, he was not being taken somewhere. He was being taken away. The flight did not end suddenly, but bled slowly into arrival, the way a dream changes shape without your noticing until you are already somewhere new. The air had been growing warmer for some time now, though he couldn't have said when it started, just as he couldn't say at what exact moment the clouds thinned into tatters and the strange light began pouring over him. It was not the light of the mortal sun. This light had weight to it, as if each beam could be held in the palm of your hand, as if it had a pulse. It streamed toward him in 1,000 shifting colors, gold so deep it seemed to hum, silver that caught in his eyelashes and made the edges of the world blur, threads of white so bright they felt alive. And as the eagle carried him higher, the shapes began to form out of that glow, impossibly tall columns that rose like trees no wind could ever sway, gates that arched so high they could have framed the moon itself, rooftops catching the light until they burned like bronze in a forge. Olympus was not just a place, it was a declaration, and the declaration was this: you do not belong here unless we decide you do. The eagle circled once, its shadow slipping over a terrace vast enough to hold the whole of Troy within its borders, and then descended in a slow, spiraling arc toward a balcony of white marble that jutted out over the nothingness below. The landing was not gentle. The talons released him only when his bare feet struck the stone hard enough to sting. A sting that felt deliberate, a reminder that this was no dream. He turned, and the eagle was gone. In its place stood a man whose height and breadth made the space around him seem smaller. His hair was black but streaked through with silver, not in the pattern of age, but in the deliberate shifting lines of storm clouds. And his eyes, pale, bright, fixed entirely on him, held the kind of focus that made breathing feel like a trespass. "Stay," Zeus said. It was not a request, and Ganymede understood, without needing to be told, that nothing about his life as he had known it would survive this word. The boy who had herded sheep on the slopes above Troy was already far behind him, not just in distance, but in time, as though the life he had lived until now belonged to someone else entirely. They moved through the halls of Olympus at a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, but deliberate, like the beat of a drum you couldn't ignore. The air smelled of cedar resin and something sweeter, myrrh perhaps, or some immortal flower that bloomed only in this place. The floor under his feet was veined marble, polished until it reflected not only his body, but the light above as if it were its own sky. He passed statues so finely carved that he was not sure they weren't breathing, their eyes following him as he walked. Fountains where the water did not fall, but hovered in arcs like strands of glass, suspended and trembling. Vines that crawled up the columns, thick with flowers in colors he didn't know names for. The gods were here too. They drifted in the periphery of his sight, some walking with purpose, others seated in quiet conversation, but all of them carrying themselves with the same unshakable certainty that they belonged here and always had. Some looked at him without interest, a mortal boy barely worth noticing. Others studied him longer, heads tilted, eyes sharp, measuring him, weighing him against whatever unspoken standard the gods kept for beauty, for youth, for worthiness. A few even smiled, though not in welcome. It was the smile of someone amused by a new pet, curious to see what tricks it might learn. At the far end of a great hall stood a table, though calling it a table felt too small. It was carved from a single piece of black stone, so deep it seemed to pull the light into it, its surface stretching so far that the details at the other end blurred into distance. Here, Zeus said, was where the gods feasted. And here, at the center beside his own place, was where Ganymede would stand. In Zeus's hand appeared a cup, small enough to hold with one hand, yet heavy as if it had been cast from the heart of the sun itself. Its surface was gold, but not the dull, cold gold of a king's hoard. This was living gold, shifting, glowing, as if it contained a hidden fire. When Zeus placed it in Ganymede's hands, the metal was warm, almost hot, and it carried the faint scent of something sweet and intoxicating. Honey and crushed pine, nectar so potent it seemed to seep into his skin through his fingers. "You will serve," Zeus said, his voice low enough that only Ganymede could hear, "and you will remain." The days that followed, if days could be counted in a place where the sun seemed to hang eternally in some golden pause between rising and setting, passed in a rhythm unlike anything he had known. He learned the names and the tastes of the gods, the exact hue of nectar Apollo preferred, the way Athena drank water so still it looked like glass, the sharp tang of wine Ares demanded before the first toast of the evening. He learned that here he would not age. The mirror told him so. Every time he passed it, the boy who stared back was unchanged, skin smooth, eyes clear, hair untouched by the faintest trace of time. It was not the unchanging stillness of a statue. It was the deliberate preservation of something chosen, like a flower cut at its most perfect bloom and kept in a vase of unending water. It might have been enough. The endless youth, the place at Zeus's side, the strange, unearthly beauty of Olympus. But one night, standing on the balcony where the air was so thin and cold it felt clean in his lungs, Zeus joined him. They stood without speaking, looking at the horizon where the stars were sharp enough to pierce the sky. Then Zeus lifted one hand and the stars shifted. A new shape pulled itself out of the darkness. A man, tall, head bowed, pouring water from an urn, the stream of it curling across the heavens in a silver arc. Beside it, another shape, smaller but no less bright, an eagle, wings spread, watching. "You will be there when the world sleeps," Zeus said. "You will be there when it wakes. Mortals will not forget you." And Ganymede understood then, in the kind of deep, quiet understanding that comes without words, that the boy from the hills of Troy had not been brought here to serve the gods alone. He had been remade into something that would outlast Troy, outlast kings, outlast the very earth under their feet. His body would live here among marble and gold and immortal faces. But another part of him, the image of him, the memory of him, would hang forever in the sky, untouchable. Far below, on nights when the air was clear and the sea calm, sailors would point to that figure and tell their own versions of the story, that he was taken because he was beautiful, or because he was loved, or because the gods desired what mortals could not keep. And Ganymede, standing on the balcony of Olympus, with the gold cup in his hands and the cold stars burning above, would know they were all right. The gods never gave back what they took. They only made it eternal. In Sparta, there were two brothers whose lives were so tightly bound that to speak of one without the other felt like a kind of lie. Castor and Pollux were born to the same mother, Leda, yet their bloodlines were divided at the root. Pollux was the son of Zeus, conceived when the king of the gods visited Leda in the guise of a swan, and with the gift of divine paternity came the gift of immortality, a life unending and unassailable. Castor, though no less noble in form or spirit, was mortal, born of Leda's husband, King Tyndareus. From their first breath, they shared everything: the cradle, the hunt, the spear, the saddle. And between them, there was no space for envy, only the unspoken knowledge that one of them would live forever, while the other could be broken by a blade. They moved through childhood as a single shape in the eyes of those who saw them, the Dioscuri, inseparable in thought and in step, each finding his place in the shadow and light of the other. Together, they joined the voyage of the Argonauts, their names etched into the same songs that carried Jason and Hercules and Orpheus across the wine-dark sea. They fought side by side, their strength amplified not by blood alone, but by a trust so deep it seemed to make them untouchable. In battle, they were a matched rhythm, two edges of the same blade, and when one struck, the other was already moving to shield, to press forward, to finish. The poets spoke of their deeds in the same breath: the rescue of their sister Helen when she was stolen, the breaking of sieges, the riding down of enemies. And always there was the image of them as one, the mortal and the immortal indistinguishable in the dust and sunlight of the field. Yet the mortal thread in their bond, the one strand that could fray, would always belong to Castor. It was the truth Pollux tried not to think about, the truth that lurked like a shadow behind each victory. That truth rose up one day in the harsh glare of the sun when they crossed paths with their cousins, Idas and Lynceus, men whose blood ties did not soften their greed. A quarrel over cattle grew into something sharper, the words flung between them hard and jagged, and soon the weapons were drawn. The air became the thick, hot stillness that comes before a storm, the earth dry and splintered underfoot, and in that heat, the bloodline they shared with their enemies counted for nothing. The fight was fast and without ceremony. The cousins' skill was real, and even the Dioscuri could not close every opening. A spear found Castor, and the force of it drove the breath from his lungs before the pain even had a chance to bloom. He fell with the weight of a tree cut at its base, his hand still gripping his weapon, the dust rising around him in a cloud that caught the sunlight in dull motes. Pollux saw him fall, and the shape of the world changed. The rhythm that had always been theirs was broken in an instant, leaving only the raw edge of rage. He struck down Lynceus without pause, his movements sharpened by the kind of focus that has no space for fear, and Zeus himself, from the height of the sky, sent a thunderbolt to end Ida's before he could strike again. When the dust settled, there was no sound, but the slow rasp of Pollux' breath and the faint hiss of the wind over the stones. Castor lay still, his skin already taking on the pale cast that does not belong to the living. Pollux knelt beside him, the space between their bodies feeling wider than any ocean, though only a few inches of bloodied ground lay between them. Here was the truth he had avoided since their birth. He would live on, and Castor would not. The thought was not a comfort. It was an emptiness that seemed to reach into the marrow of his bones. The immortality that had once been a gift now felt like a sentence, a promise to endure without the one person who had made endurance bearable. The field around them seemed to fade until there was nothing but the two of them, one breathing, one not, and the knowledge that no battle could be fought against this. The gods had shaped them unequally at the start, and now that shaping had reached its end, the mortal half of their shared life was finished, leaving Pollux with the immortal half still stretching endlessly before him, empty as the sky over the battlefield. Pollux remained on the field long after the fight had ended, long after the last echo of the thunderbolt had faded from the hills. The sun was lowering, dragging its light across the ground in a dull wash of gold, and still he stayed beside Castor, as if keeping vigil might hold back the truth for just a little longer. The blood had dried on Castor's side, dark and brittle now, his face calm in the strange, almost mocking way the dead sometimes look, as if they have simply stepped into a silence deeper than anything the living can touch. Pollux felt the hours bending and breaking in strange ways. He could not remember when he had last drawn a full breath without feeling the weight of it in his chest. For the first time in his life, he understood the loneliness that could exist even when the gods themselves were near. The immortality in his veins, the same immortality that had let him charge into every fight without fear, had become a thing he could not carry alone. He had fought alongside many men, kings, heroes, even those whose names would be sung for centuries. But Castor had been something else entirely, not a comrade, but an extension of himself, the other half of the shape they had made together. Without him, Pollux felt like a weapon without a wielder, a form without a shadow. His mind kept circling back to the same fact. He would walk away from this place, and Castor would not. He could ride across the whole of the known world, cross seas and climb mountains, and still he would be apart from him, because no road could reach the place where mortals go when their time is ended. It was then, in the depth of this hollow, that his thoughts turned upward. Zeus had been watching them all their lives. In the hunt, in the games, in the battles fought shoulder to shoulder. He had seen how their bond worked like a force of its own, unshaken even by the imbalance the gods had set between them at birth. Pollux, still kneeling in the dust beside his brother, let the knowledge settle in him. There was only one way forward that did not break them apart entirely. He would not keep what had been given to him if it meant carrying it alone. If immortality was only a long road without Castor, then he would step off it willingly. The sky had been heavy with cloud all afternoon, but now it began to shift. The light changed, not brighter, not darker, but denser, as though the air itself had thickened. The wind stilled. In the silence came the deep, steady pressure of a presence larger than the land or sea. Pollux lifted his head and felt it without needing to see. Zeus was here. The choice had already been made, or perhaps it had been waiting to be made since the moment the twins were born. Immortality was not an indivisible thing, not if the gods willed it otherwise. The decree, when it came, was not bound in the pomp of mortal ceremony. It was a simple truth laid across the world like a new law of nature. The brothers would share what had once belonged only to Pollux. They would be as they had been in life, together, but not in the same place at the same time. One day they would dwell in the bright halls of Olympus, the other among the silent fields of the underworld. One day in the blaze of the living, one day in the shadow of the dead. And so it would go, each in turn stepping into the other's place, neither wholly alive nor wholly gone. The change came without pain, but it was not without weight. Pollux felt his body grow lighter even as his soul grew heavier, bound now to the strange balance that would hold them forever. Castor's eyes opened again, not with the spark of mortality, but with the calm, steady flame of something beyond it. The wound in his side was gone. The dust brushed from his skin as if it had never been there. They rose together, neither needing to speak the truth they both knew. They were no longer bound by the laws of mortals, nor were they free of the pull of death. In time, mortals would look to the sky and see the shape of their bond fixed in the constellations. Gemini, the twins, set side by side among the stars, a reminder that the love between them had been strong enough to bend even the will of Zeus. Sailors would call on them in storms, claiming to see twin lights dancing on the masts of their ships, knowing the Dioscuri had come to guide them through the night. Farmers, travelers, and wanderers would speak of them in quiet prayers, invoking the brothers who knew what it was to stand between life and death and to walk willingly in both. And so the cycle began, unbroken and endless. Day for one, night for the other. Joy and shadow exchanged and exchanged again. Not the full immortality of the gods, not the brief, bright flame of mortals, but something stranger, an eternal tether between two halves of the same soul crossing the divide forever. In the time when heroes still walked the earth and the gods took lovers from among mortals, there was born to Apollo a son whose name would one day be spoken in the same breath as life itself. Asclepius came into the world already marked by strangeness. His mother, Coronis, had betrayed Apollo's love, and for that she was struck down before the child could take his first breath. Yet in the moment of her death, Apollo snatched the infant from her body and placed him in the care of Chiron, the wise centaur whose cave in the mountains was a place of both healing and prophecy. There, surrounded by the scent of pine resin and mountain herbs, Asclepius grew not into a warrior like so many sons of gods, but into something rarer, a man whose power lay in restoring life, not taking it. From Chiron, he learned the secret languages of the body, the way fever moves through the skin, the sound of breath when the lungs are heavy with sickness, the slow winding of the pulse when death draws near. He learned to grind leaves into poultices that cooled burning flesh, to draw poison from wounds with the root of gentian, to splint bones so precisely that the limb would knit itself straight again. But Asclepius's gift reached beyond skill. It was as if the mortal barrier between the living and the dead was thinner for him than for others. His hands were steady in ways that no teaching could grant, and there were moments when he seemed to feel the illness inside another person. as if it were his own. Word of his ability spread quickly, first through shepherds who brought their injured sheep to him, then through villages, then across the cities of Greece. Men and women traveled for days to find him, carried on litters or leaning on the arms of their kin, and few left without being healed. Temples began to form around his name, simple at first, a single column, an altar, a shaded place for the sick to rest, but growing as the stories multiplied. People began to say that not only could he heal any wound, but that he could hold death at bay. And then came the tale that would change everything, that Asclepius had called a dead man back into life. Some said it was Hippolytus, restored to the world at the request of Artemis. Others whispered of nameless men and women pulled back from the banks of the Styx. Whatever the truth, the act was more than a miracle. It was a transgression. To the gods, the order of the world was clear. Mortals were born, they lived their allotted time, and they died. The underworld kept what it was given. Hades, lord of that realm, felt the slight like a wound. If one man could overturn death, even for a moment, the balance of all things could be undone. But it was not Hades who struck. Word reached Zeus, and with it the warning that Asclepius's gift, if left unchecked, would make mortals believe they could live without the gods. His cures would weaken the power of Olympus itself. The thought was not tolerated. Without ceremony, without trial, the decision was made. The sky over the land where Asclepius was working darkened with unnatural speed. The air thickened, not with the damp of rain, but with the electric heaviness that comes before a storm no mortal can endure. From the height of Olympus, Zeus hurled a single thunderbolt, the pure white fire of it tearing through the clouds with a sound that split the air like the world's first breath. It found Asclepius where he stood, striking him through in an instant. There was no chance to turn, no chance to cry out. The body that had bent over so many wounds, the hands that had steadied so many dying hearts, fell lifeless to the ground. The earth held the mark of the blow, a blackened scar where the grass would not grow, and the people who came after found him lying in the stillness of one who had finally crossed into the very realm he had so often defied. Around him, the air still smelled faintly of burned air and crushed herbs, the remnants of the healer's last day. His temples were filled with mourning, the sick who had waited for his touch now turning away in grief, knowing there would be no one like him again. The body of Asclepius lay in stillness, but the news of his fall moved swiftly through the world of gods and men alike. In the temples where the sick had once come to sleep on the sacred floors, hoping for the dream that would reveal his cure, the air thickened with grief. Those who had been healed by his hands lit fires and left offerings at the altars, their prayers quieter now, tinged with disbelief that even he, the one who had seemed beyond the reach of ordinary death, had been struck down. The mortals saw only the end, but in Olympus there was movement beneath the surface, currents of decision and defiance that would not let this death remain a simple one. Apollo, who had claimed Asclepius as his son from the moment of his first breath, did not take the loss in silence. He had known from the beginning that Zeus would not overlook such a challenge to the balance, but knowing had done nothing to dull the blow. In the chasms of the underworld, Apollo could almost feel his son's presence. The divine spark pressed into the grey silence among the countless souls who had come before him. Yet Asclepius was not like those others. His death had not been a failure or the slow erosion of time. It had been a sentence, swift and absolute, passed down from the heights of Olympus itself. To leave him there would be to accept that death was final, even for those whose entire existence had been a defiance of it. There were gods who agreed with Zeus's judgment, who believed that a mortal who could bring back the dead would one day unmake the natural order. But there were others who did not. Gods who had seen the good in Asclepius's works, who had felt the reverence mortals gave him not out of fear, but gratitude. Among the immortals there was a kind of power that came not from strength or dominion, but from the simple act of giving life back where it had been taken, and in Asclepius, that power had been pure. It was this purity, this refusal to take more than he gave, that made Apollo's grief sharper and his resolve immovable. It was not through battle or the clash of arms that Apollo acted, but through a petition, direct and unrelenting. He went to Zeus not in the heat of rage, but with the weight of a father's grief sharpened into a single purpose. Zeus, for all his authority, understood that some deaths could not remain as they were without creating a wound in the fabric of the world that would never close. And so, whether moved by Apollo's plea, by his own recognition of Asclepius's worth, or by the knowledge that mercy could sometimes serve Olympus better than fear, Zeus allowed what had been taken to be given back, not as it was before, but in a new and unchangeable form. The summons went out, and from the silent halls of Hades, the spirit of Asclepius was lifted. No mortal breath filled his lungs. No heartbeat thudded in his chest as before. Instead, the essence of him, the memory of every cure, the steady precision of his hands, the endless patience in his gaze, was drawn upward, away from the shadowed banks of the Styx, away from the murmuring dead, through the narrow, twisting path that only the gods could walk between death and life. The underworld receded, and the brightness of Olympus grew ahead, not the flickering brightness of a sunbeam, but the constant radiance of a place that had never known decay. When Asclepius stepped into that light, he was no longer mortal. The weight of the body he had carried was gone, replaced by a form that could not tire, could not falter, could not be undone by time or wound. His mortal life, with all its constraints and limits, was behind him. In its place was the unending span of a god's existence, and with it, the charge that defined his place among the immortals. He would not be a warrior, nor a keeper of storms or harvests, but the god of medicine itself, the protector of healers, the embodiment of every hope that stands against the darkness of disease and the finality of death. Temples rose to him not just in Greece but across the known world. Pilgrims came to sleep beneath their roofs, seeking dreams in which the god would come to them with instructions for their healing. Serpents, sacred to his cult, coiled in the shadows of the altars, their movements a sign of his presence. The staff he carried, twined with a single serpent, became the sign by which the sick and their healers knew his favor, an image so enduring that it would survive in memory far beyond the fall of the cities that first carved it. Even the sky bore witness to his elevation. Among the constellations, Ophiuchus, the serpent-bearer, shone with a steady light, said to be Asclepius himself, a reminder that the one who had been struck down for overstepping the bounds of mortality had been raised beyond them entirely. In this place, in this form, no thunderbolt could reach him again. His death had been meant as a warning, but his return became something else, a promise that the gift he embodied, the power to heal, would remain in the world unbroken as long as there were mortals to call his name. And so, Asclepius took his place among the immortals. not through conquest or the spilling of blood, but through a life that had turned the tide of death itself, and through a death that the gods themselves could not leave untouched. On the island of Crete, under the relentless gaze of a sun that seemed older than the stones of its palaces, there lived a princess whose name would outlast her kingdom. Ariadne was the daughter of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae, born into a house that was both rich in power and tangled in the dark threads of divine interference. Her life had been shaped from the beginning by the will of the gods, though not always in ways she could see. Her father ruled with the confidence of a man favored by Poseidon, yet his reign was shadowed by the monstrous legacy hidden deep beneath the palace. The labyrinth, a prison of twisting corridors and endless turns, built to contain the Minotaur, a creature who was her half-brother through a union so unnatural it was spoken of only in whispers. Ariadne grew up with the knowledge of that great living shadow beneath her feet, the slow, echoing thud of its presence carried up through stone and earth when the palace was still at night. It was into this world that Theseus came, the Prince of Athens, sent as part of the tribute demanded by Minos. Young men and women to be sent into the labyrinth and never seen again. The Athenian came not as a lamb to slaughter, but as a hunter, his purpose sharpened to a single point: to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. Ariadne watched him from a distance at first, noting the steadiness of his step, the way his gaze moved not with fear but with calculation. In a place where the labyrinth had always been the final word, Theseus seemed like a man who had come to rewrite it. That thought alone was enough to stir something in her, a pull not just of admiration, but of recognition, as though she had been waiting her whole life for someone who could make the walls shift. When she chose to help him, it was not in the heat of a single moment, but in the quiet certainty that came from knowing what would happen if she did nothing. She went to him with the tools he would need: a sword sharp enough to pierce the Minotaur's hide, and a ball of thread to lead him back through the twisting dark. It was a simple gift, yet it carried the weight of treachery against her own blood, the risk of her father's wrath, and the certainty that her life on Crete would end the moment she placed it in his hands. She gave it anyway, and with it, she gave herself to the hope that there was a life for her beyond the stone corridors and the beast that haunted them. Theseus went into the labyrinth and did not return for hours. Ariadne waited in the silence that pressed close against the palace walls, her mind running the turns of the maze as if she could trace his path from where she stood. At last, the thread pulled taut, and then he emerged, blood on his arms, the sword dark and wet, the air around him carrying the heavy smell of death and freedom. The Minotaur was dead, and with it, the hold the labyrinth had kept over the island. They fled that night. The sea lay before them, black and gleaming, the wind sharp with salt. Ariadne left without looking back, her feet carrying her away from the life she had known with an ease that startled her. Theseus was at her side, and she believed, truly believed, that they would build something together far from the reach of Crete. Each stroke of the oars carried them toward a new horizon, and she let herself think of a future that had nothing to do with mazes or monsters. But the gods have always had their own designs for mortal love. After days at sea, they came to the island of Naxos. It was here, on this shore of pale sand and jagged rock, that the thread Ariadne had given to guide Theseus through the labyrinth was cut in another way. She slept that night under the open sky, the stars bright enough to paint silver on her skin, the sound of the waves steady and close. When she woke, The light was sharp, the sand hot beneath her, and Theseus was gone. His ship was already a dark smear on the horizon, sails catching the wind that carried him away. The emptiness beside her was not just absence, it was the sudden collapse of everything she had built in her mind since the night she had given him the thread. The air tasted different now, bitter where it had been clean, and the sea, which had seemed to promise escape, now stretched endless and indifferent before her. Alone on the shore, with no way to return to Crete and no place to go forward, she understood that betrayal can be as quiet as a man walking away without a word. The waves rolled in and out, steady as breathing, the sky unchanged, the island silent except for the small sounds of the tide. Ariadne sat with the heat of the sand sinking into her bones, her gaze fixed on the place where the sea met the sky, knowing that the life she had imagined had been taken from her in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The day passed on Naxos without measure, the sun climbing and falling in the slow arc that meant nothing to her now. Ariadne remained on the shore, the place where the sand met the rocks and the rocks met the water, as if some part of her believed that Theseus might turn back, that the shape of his sails might return against the horizon. But the sea has no loyalty to human grief. It carried him onward with the same rhythm it carried everything, wave folding into wave, erasing footprints as if they had never been made. Hunger came to her in faint edges, but never enough to drive her inland. Thirst was a dull ache she barely noticed, dulled by the greater hollow inside her. Time thinned and stretched until it felt like she had always been there. Sitting where the tide's reach could sometimes touch her toes, neither entirely in the world of the living nor entirely outside it. It was in that in-between state, half in waking and half in a strange drifting, that the air began to change. The wind that moved across the water shifted, warmer now, carrying scents she did not know. The sweetness of ripe grapes, the faint spice of crushed leaves, something wild and green beneath it all. The waves no longer broke with their usual rhythm. They seemed to rise and fall to a slower beat, as though keeping time with something unseen. And from the edges of her vision came movement, small at first, a flash of color, a sway that didn't match the wind until she realized she was not alone on the shore. Figures emerged from the line where the sea met the land. Some were women crowned with ivy and vine leaves, their hair loose and shining, their bare feet leaving no mark on the sand. Others were men with the lean, restless shapes of dancers, their skin painted with spirals and streaks of deep red. Around them came the sounds of small bells and the hollow thump of drums, the music slipping into her chest like a second heartbeat. This was no mortal procession. Ariadne recognized them without knowing their names. The Theseus, the sacred company of Dionysus, the god who moved between the realms of order and abandon, life and death, mortal and divine. The air thickened as they drew near, and from among them stepped the god himself. He was nothing like Theseus. Dionysus's presence was not a fixed point, but a shifting tide. Eyes that seemed to hold both the calm stillness of deep water and the sudden flash of wine spilling in firelight. His hair was dark, his skin touched by the same sun that shone over mortal lands. Yet there was an unbroken quality to him, a sense that he could step from this shore into any other world and be equally at home. Around his brow lay a crown of ivy, green and living, as if the plants had grown there of their own will. In the myths that would be told later, there would be different reasons given for his arrival. Some would say he had been passing the island and saw her there, abandoned, and took pity. Others would say he had known from the moment she left Crete that she was meant for him, that Theseus had only been a thread in a larger weaving. Whatever the truth, in that moment, Ariadne's life bent away from the ruin Theseus had left her in and towards something vast enough to hold the full weight of her sorrow. The gods' company surrounded her, their movements slow and unthreatening, as if they were part of the tide come ashore. In the space between one breath and the next, the emptiness in her chest loosened, and the air she drew in was rich with scents and sounds she had never known. The promise of festivals that burned through the night, of music that could shake the walls of palaces, of joy fierce enough to be its own kind of power. Dionysus placed in her hair a crown of gold, its points fine and delicate as a star's first light. And in that gesture, there was no hesitation, as if it had always belonged there. From that shore, the god took her away from the emptiness of Naxos into the life of his own realm, a life that was both mortal and more than mortal, where the vines grew heavy with fruit even in the lean months, and the rivers ran clear over beds of smooth stone. The diadem he had given her was later lifted by his hand and set in the sky itself, so that its curve could be seen on clear nights as the constellation Corona Borealis, a fragment of her life preserved among the stars. In Olympus, her name would not be Ariadne alone, but the name of a goddess, the immortal wife of Dionysus, her mortality shed like the salt on her skin after leaving the sea. Her place was now fixed among the immortals, yet the stories of her mortal life were not erased. She was remembered as the princess who had defied the labyrinth, the woman abandoned by a hero and found by a god, a figure whose fate moved between the extremes of betrayal and devotion. And in her own being, Ariadne carried those truths together. The weight of what had been lost and the vast, untouchable life she now lived, bound not by the designs of mortal kings, but by the unending revels of a god who had claimed her as his own. Before the first ship of the Greek fleet had cut through the dark water toward Troy, before the 10 years of war and the ruin of kings, there was a silence at Aulis, a silence so deep it felt like a wound in the air. Hundreds of ships waited in the narrow strait, their masts still, their sails hanging loose, the bronze prows pointing east toward the war they could not yet begin. The sea lay flat and glassy, the sky above it heavy with unmoving cloud, and the days passed in a stasis that seemed almost unnatural. The men whispered among themselves, for it was known that the delay was not by chance. The goddess Artemis, offended by a slight that came not from the army as a whole, but from one man, their leader, Agamemnon, had stilled the winds. Some said it was a careless boast of the king's hunting skill, spoken too loudly, claiming he was Artemis's equal with the bow. Others claimed a sacred deer had been killed, one whose life was not his to take. Whatever the cause, the punishment was clear. The fleet would not move until the goddess's anger was appeased. The seers spoke, and their words fell like stones into the waiting camp. Artemis would only be placated if Agamemnon gave up the life of his daughter Iphigenia. She was the eldest child of his house, the daughter of Queen Clytemnestra, and her death, the seers said, would unbind the wind. There was no way to disguise the meaning of the prophecy. It demanded not symbolic offering, not a token of remorse, but the blood of a maiden whose life was bound by family to the man who now held command over the greatest force Greece had ever gathered. Agamemnon's heart wavered between the war he had sworn to lead and the life he had raised from birth. But in the way of kings who carry more than one kind of duty, he sent for her. Messengers were dispatched to Mycenae with a falsehood, that she was to come to Aulis to be given in marriage to the hero Achilles, a match that would honor her and bind their house to one of Greece's greatest warriors. The promise drew Clytemnestra and Iphigenia willingly from the safety of their palace, their minds full of the joy and ceremony of the marriage to come. They came without the guards that would have marked a time of danger, without the weight of suspicion in their hearts, for the sea and sky gave no sign of what was to come. When they arrived, the truth began to take shape around them in fragments. The solemn faces of the men, the absence of any wedding feast, the way no one spoke of Achilles in their presence. The space prepared for the altar stood on the shore, its surface washed in the pale light of dawn, garlands of flowers hanging limp in the still air. Iphigenia's eyes moved from her father to the men who stood behind him, the cold gleam of their armor catching the light. And in that moment, she seemed to understand without needing to be told. She had come not to join her life to another's, but to end it in the service of a cause chosen by others. The camp gathered to witness, as they always did when the gods were to be honored. The sea was silent, the wind absent, the air carrying the faint scent of salt and ash from the altar's fire. Iphigenia was led forward, her steps even, her gaze level, though the weight of what was being asked pressed on her like the shadow of the mountain behind them. She was young, still in the first bloom of womanhood, but she stood without struggle, without turning her face away from the place where the sacrifice would be made. The men who had faced war without flinching could not meet her eyes. The priests moved through their preparations with the slow precision of ritual, their hands steady as they poured the libations, their voices low as they spoke the words to Artemis. Agamemnon stood apart, his shoulders rigid, his hands hidden in the folds of his cloak, the muscles of his jaw working against what his voice could not say. Some would tell the story later, as if Iphigenia had gone willingly, offering herself for the sake of the fleet, the war, and the honor of Greece. Others would remember her as a victim, silent but unyielding, whose life was taken without her consent. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between, in the stillness of her body, in the way her eyes never left the horizon where the ships waited for the wind that would come only after her breath had left her. The altar was ready. The knife, honed to a thin, gleaming edge, was lifted by the high priest. The camp seemed to hold its breath. The world contracted to a single point, the place where steel and flesh would meet, where the balance between mortal and divine would be struck. The air felt dense, as if the moment before the blow could stretch forever. And then, in a movement no one saw coming, the light shifted, a sudden brightness, not the burning flare of Zeus's thunderbolt, but the soft, enveloping radiance of Artemis herself. A wind rose from nowhere, scattering the petals from the garlands, stirring the surface of the sea. When the glare cleared, the altar stood empty. In Iphigenia's place lay a deer, its coat marked with the pale dappling of sunlight through leaves, its breath quick in its chest, its eyes wide and dark. The goddess had taken the maiden before the blade could touch her, lifting her away from the shore, away from the still ships and the war that waited beyond them. No mortal hand could follow where she had gone, and the fleet, finding their sacrifice accepted, felt the first stirrings of wind on their sails. Iphigenia's fate was now in the hands of Artemis alone. When the light of Artemis closed around Iphigenia, it was not like the light of the mortal sun, which falls on the skin and fades. It was an enclosing brightness, without source or shadow, a weightless radiance that seemed to draw her upward through the air without movement of her own. The voices of the camp at Aulis vanished behind her like the sound of waves receding, and even the steady thump of her heart seemed to loosen its hold. She did not feel the pull of the earth beneath her feet, or the sting of salt in the wind. The world that had been hers a heartbeat before was simply gone. When the brightness thinned, she found herself standing on ground that was not the shore she had left, though the air here was clear and cold, and the sea was still visible in the distance. The place was high and wild, the land cut by cliffs and deep inlets, the rocks worn into shapes that seemed older than the gods themselves. Here, the smell of salt was carried on winds that came without warning, and seabirds wheeled in the sharp light. It was Tauris, a land far from Greece, and yet she had been brought here in the space between one breath and the next. Artemis had not left her in the care of mortals. This place was sacred to the goddess, and Iphigenia was not to live here as a wanderer or as a queen's daughter taken from her home. She was to serve. The goddess placed her as high priestess in the temple at the edge of the sea, a building of heavy stone, its columns cut to withstand the endless wind. It was a post of honor, but one steeped in shadow, for the rites of Tauris demanded blood. Strangers who came to the shore, whether by shipwreck, mischance, or design, were brought to the temple, and the goddess's will, as the Taurians believed it, was that they be sacrificed. Iphigenia's hands became the ones to prepare the victims, her voice the one to speak the prayers, her face the one they saw before the end. Her life settled into this pattern, not measured by seasons, but by the slow accumulation of offerings, each one marking another turn in the long cycle of the goddess's service. Yet in that service, there was no decay of the body, no withering of youth. The years passed, and she remained as she had been when Artemis had taken her, unlined, unbent, her hair still catching the same gleam it had under the Greek sun. She began to understand that her life was no longer bound to the mortal span. The other priestesses aged, their faces shifting through the years until they were replaced by new ones. But Iphigenia remained, a constant presence at the temple's heart, the same eyes watching the waves crash against the rocks, the same hands lifting the blade in ritual. There were stories whispered among those who served her, that she was more than a priestess, that she had once been destined for another kind of death, and had been claimed instead by the goddess's favor. In some tellings, Artemis would in time free her from the temple, lifting her away again as she had from Aulis, not to another place of service, but to the realm of the immortals. In others, she was carried to the White Isle, the hidden land where heroes dwell after death. And there she was given to Achilles, the two of them united in a kind of afterlife, untouched by decay. And in another, older strand of the tale, she was not merely granted a place among the blessed dead, but transformed entirely, becoming Hecate, the moonlit goddess of magic and crossroads. Her mortal past dissolved into the eternal identity of a divinity who stands at the boundaries between worlds. Whatever the truth, her life after Aulis was no longer shaped by the choices of men. She had been taken from the altar of sacrifice and set upon a path where the years no longer pressed down, where death was a thing that could pass through others, but not through her. The wind off the Taurian sea would never again carry her home to Mycenae, yet she was no longer bound to the fate of mortals. She had crossed into a different kind of existence, one drawn out not in the fragile steps of human life, but in the long, unbroken tread of one who serves in the shadow of the gods. There was once a princess so beautiful that her name traveled farther than the borders of her father's kingdom, a beauty so complete it drew people from distant lands not to ask for her hand, but simply to look upon her. Psyche was her name, and though she was the youngest of three sisters, her face and form eclipsed them both, as if she had stepped from the hand of a god while they had been shaped by mortal nature alone. The fame of her beauty spread until temples dedicated to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, stood empty as worshippers turned instead to gaze at the mortal girl, laying flowers at her feet as though she were a divinity in the flesh. This adoration was not devotion, but theft. Each prayer to Psyche was a prayer unspoken to Aphrodite, each garland for her an altar left bare for the goddess. Aphrodite's anger, when it came, was not the swift strike of a passing storm, but the slow, deliberate gathering of a tide that knows it will drown the shore in time. She sent for her son, Eros, the god who guided the arrows of love, and commanded him to punish the mortal girl whose beauty threatened her own worship. Psyche was to be made to love the most wretched of men, someone beneath her in every way, so that her glory would turn to shame. But gods are not immune to the snares they set for others, and when Eros came to do his mother's bidding, he saw her and faltered. His arrow, meant for her heart, turned in his hand, striking him instead, and from that instant he was bound to her by a force as unyielding as the fates themselves. Psyche, knowing nothing of this, found herself carried away from her family, her life broken apart by an oracle's decree that she was destined to marry not a mortal man, but a monstrous being who waited for her on a distant mountain. She was left there in mourning, the wind lifting her from the earth and bearing her to a palace of impossible beauty. There she was given every comfort, fine food, music, gardens heavy with blossoms, and each night her husband came to her. But he came in darkness, and she was forbidden to see his face. His voice was gentle, his presence warm, and over time her fear softened into love. But still the mystery of who or what he was grew into a sharp ache inside her. It was her sisters who fanned that ache into action. Visiting her in the palace, they spoke with the poison of envy, telling her that she had been deceived, that she lay each night beside a monster whose kindness was only a trap before he destroyed her. They urged her to light a lamp while he slept, to look upon him and see the truth. Psyche resisted at first, but the seed had been planted, and one night she rose from their bed and brought the flame near. What she saw was not a monster, but the god of love himself, his face serene in sleep, his hair falling like gold over his brow, the faint shimmer of his wings at his back. In her shock, a drop of oil from the lamp fell onto his skin, and he woke. Betrayed by her lack of trust, Eros fled, vanishing into the darkness, leaving her alone in the vast, empty palace. Her grief was immediate and complete, but she did not let it crush her into stillness. She set out to find him, wandering from one end of the earth to the other, seeking any who could tell her where he had gone. It was this search that brought her to the feet of Aphrodite herself. The goddess, still burning with the insults Psyche's beauty had once given her, saw her chance to grind the mortal girl into the dust before even thinking of granting her what she sought. If Psyche wanted her husband back, she would have to earn him. The trials Aphrodite set before her were not meant to be passed. They were meant to break her. The first task was to sort a mountain of seeds, wheat, barley, millet, poppy, chickpeas, and more. An impossible tangle that covered the floor in a mound as high as her shoulders. She was given no tool, no aid, and the sun was already lowering in the sky. Yet help came from the smallest of creatures. Ants swarmed into the chamber, and as if obeying some hidden command, divided the seeds into neat, perfect piles before the night had fallen. The second trial sent her into a meadow where golden-fleeced rams grazed, beasts so fierce they would tear apart any who came too near. She was to bring back a portion of their wool, yet not risk her life in the attempt. Watching them from a distance, she waited until the heat of midday drove them to the shade. Their tempers cooled in rest, and then she gathered the tufts of fleece caught on the thorn bushes where they had passed. The third task was the most dangerous yet, to climb to the source of the Black River Styx and bring back water in a crystal flask. The cliffs were steep, the currents raging, guarded by serpents that hissed at any who approached. She could not have done it had an eagle, sacred to Zeus, not swooped down, taken the flask from her hands, and filled it for her, delivering it back without harm. But Aphrodite was not finished. The final trial was one of descent into the underworld itself, to fetch a fragment of Persephone's beauty, sealed in a box, and return it without opening it. Guided by the advice of a tower that spoke with the voice of wisdom, Psyche found her way to the realm of the dead, offering the proper coins to Charon, the ferryman, and barley cakes to Cerberus, the great hound at the gates. She took the box from Persephone's hands and began the journey back, carrying it close to her. It was then that the old temptation of mortals overcame her. She thought that perhaps, with a touch of that beauty, she might appear more divine to Eros when they met again. She opened the box and found not beauty, but a heavy, enchanted sleep, which fell upon her in an instant. She collapsed where she stood, her body still and her chest unmoving, the underworld's shadow clinging to her like a shroud. And so, at the end of her trials, Psyche lay motionless, not broken by the impossibility of her tasks, but by the smallest act of her own human longing. Psyche lay where she had fallen, her body slack and unmoving, her skin pale as if the color had drained from it into the earth beneath her. The box of Persephone's gift had slipped from her fingers, resting half open on the ground beside her, its contents no longer visible, but still seeping into the air like an invisible fog. It was not a natural sleep that held her, not the kind from which warmth and touch might wake her, but the heavy, unmoving weight of an enchantment older than her life, the same enchantment that lay over all those who had crossed into the underworld and not returned. The world around her moved on, the wind shifting through the grasses, the faint rustle of small creatures moving in the undergrowth. But for her, time had stopped. It was Eros who found her. His absence from her side had been long enough to harden into an ache that refused to ease. And though he had withdrawn in anger after she had broken his trust, the bond between them had never loosened its grip. From the height of the air, on wings that beat with the strength of the god of love, he searched until he saw her lying in the stillness of the mortal world, her hair spread over the ground like spilled night, her hands empty. He descended in silence, the air parting around him, the gold of his bow and quiver catching the light. Standing beside her, he looked at the stillness of her face, the faint slackness of her mouth, and whatever anger he had once carried burned away into something quieter but sharper. The unshakable knowledge that he would not leave her here, not like this, not in the cold space between life and death. He bent over her, and with the lightest touch, the point of an arrow drawn across her skin, he released her from the spell. It was not the arrow's wound that woke her, but the god's power itself, the essence of desire and life woven into the golden metal. The heavy stillness that had pinned her down slipped away all at once, like a shadow retreating from the dawn, and breath filled her lungs again. Her eyes opened, not with the panic of someone startled awake, but with the slow clarity of one who has been far away and is only now returning. She saw him above her, the air behind his shoulders stirring with the movement of his wings, and in that moment, all the trials, all the wandering and the pain gathered into a single, undeniable truth. They were bound to each other, not by oath or by the whim of a god, but by something older and deeper. Yet even the power of Eros could not erase what had passed between them, nor could it mend the breach entirely. To be joined again, they would need the consent of the gods, and that meant facing the one who had set Psyche on this path, Aphrodite. The goddess's resentment had not vanished, but in the face of Eros's insistence and Psyche's endurance through every impossible task, even she could not claim that the mortal was unworthy. Still, the union of a god and a mortal was not a thing to be left in the balance. Such bonds were fragile in the eyes of Olympus, prone to fracture under the weight of their differences. Only one solution would make their union whole. Psyche must no longer be mortal. They came before Zeus, the king of the gods, not in a display of defiance, but as petitioners with their case already written in the language of trial and perseverance. The story was told in full. The beauty that had drawn the worship of mortals away from the goddess of love, the anger it had stirred, the son sent to bring punishment who instead brought his heart, the marriage in shadow, the betrayal in light, the endless journey through the world and the underworld, and the tasks passed against all odds. Zeus, who had seen countless loves bloom and wither, weighed what stood before him and found it worth preserving. In his hands appeared a cup, its surface hammered gold, deep enough to hold the drink that belonged only to the gods. This was ambrosia, the food of immortality, and it was not given lightly. He held it out to Psyche, and she took it with both hands, feeling the weight of it not only in her palms, but in the air itself, as though the moment pressed down from every direction. The liquid within caught the light and held it, a slow swirl of gold and white that moved as though alive. She drank. The change was not violent, not a shattering of the body, but a quiet, steady transformation that sank into her bones and settled in the very fibers of her being. Her breath no longer carried the faint edge of mortality. Her heart beat with the unhurried rhythm of the deathless. The weariness of her trials, the heaviness of her wounds and fears, fell away as though they had never been. She was not remade as something other than herself. Her face was the same, her voice the same, but the fragile thread that had tied her to the mortal span had been cut, and in its place was a bond that no sickness, no age, no end could undo. In the halls of Olympus, her marriage to Eros was celebrated without secrecy or shadow. The gods who had doubted her came to see what she had become, and even Aphrodite, whether out of acceptance or simply the acknowledgement of what could not be changed, welcomed her as daughter-in-law. Psyche's name, meaning soul, took on a truth that reached beyond her mortal life. She had endured the descent into darkness, the weight of the impossible, and the trial of her own weakness, and she had risen from it unbroken. From that day forward, she was counted among the immortals, not as a goddess of power over others, but as a goddess whose story was a testament to what even the most fragile of beings could endure for love. Her image, beside Eros, would appear in temples and on the painted walls of villas, a mortal soul who had crossed the chasm between death and life, and found her place, not by birthright, but by the long road of trials that she had walked to its very end. In the long, tangled line of Greek heroes, none bore a life so vast in its trials, or so heavy in its consequences, as Hercules. He was born in Thebes, but his beginnings were already marked by the entanglement of mortal and divine. His mother, Alcmene, was mortal, his father nominally Amphitryon, but in truth Zeus himself had come to her in the form of her husband. The child's first breath was already caught in the threads of Hera's anger, for she, the queen of the gods, had endured her husband's endless betrayals, but could not bear the thought of another mortal child raised as proof of them. Heracles' cradle was thus never a place of peace. While still an infant, he lay between his twin brother Iphicles when two serpents, sent by Hera, slid silently into the chamber, their coils glinting in the firelight. Iphicles cried out, but Heracles reached for the snakes, not with fear, but with the grip of one who already possessed unnatural strength. When his parents came, they found the child playing with the lifeless bodies of the serpents as if they were harmless toys. This strength did not protect him from the cruelty of fate. Hera's hatred did not fade with his growth. Instead, it hardened into a constant presence that would bend his life into a shape she desired, one of suffering and penance. Heracles married Megara, a princess of Thebes, and in their early years together they had children, filling the palace with the noise of small feet and the promise of a quiet, long life. But Hera's hand fell again, twisting his mind into a storm of madness so complete he could no longer see his wife and children as they were. In the blind violence of that fit, he killed them all. When the madness broke and clarity returned like the slow lifting of a heavy fog, he saw what he had done, and no weight of strength could keep him from sinking under it. The blood of his own family stained his hands, and no excuse could wash it away. Seeking a way to cleanse himself, he went to the oracle at Delphi, and the Pythia, speaking with the voice of Apollo, told him the only path to atonement was to serve Eurystheus, king of Tiryns, for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king set before him. The tasks Eurystheus devised were not meant to purify Heracles, but to destroy him. Yet each one only added to his renown. He strangled the Nemean lion, whose hide no weapon could pierce, and wore its skin thereafter as both armor and emblem. He slew the Hydra, though each head severed grew back twofold, and only by searing the stumps with fire did he still its regeneration. He captured the Ceryneian hind, swift and sacred to Artemis, and the Erymanthian boar, whose tusks could gut a man in a heartbeat. He cleansed the Augean stables in a single day by diverting the course of a river, subdued the Stymphalian birds with arrows, captured the Cretan bull, and tamed the man-eating horses of Diomedes. He took the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, drove off the cattle of Geryon after crossing the boundaries of the world, stole the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, and descended into the underworld itself to bring up Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, without weapon or harm. These labors did not erase the blood on his hands, but they carved his name into the bedrock of mortal memory. And yet, for all his victories, Hera's shadow still followed. He took wives and lovers, fathered children, fought wars, and roamed the edges of the known world. But his life was never free of betrayal, exile, or sudden calamity. The end began not on a battlefield, but in what seemed at first a moment of reconciliation. Heracles married again, this time to Deianira, a princess of Calydon, and together they traveled until they came to a river where the centaur Nessus offered to carry Deianira across while Heracles swam. But midway, Nessus attempted to take her by force, and Heracles, seeing this from the far bank, shot him with one of his arrows, the tip still smeared with the venomous blood of the Hydra. As he lay dying, Nessus gave Deianira what he claimed was a charm to keep her husband's love, telling her to take some of his blood and keep it safe. Years later, when Deianira began to fear Heracles' affections were turning toward another woman, she remembered the centaur's words. She soaked a robe in the blood and sent it to him, believing it would bind his heart to her. But the blood, mixed with the Hydra's venom, was no charm. It was a slow, burning poison. When Heracles put on the robe, the venom sank into his flesh. It was not the sharp, clean agony of a blade, but a deep, unrelenting fire that spread through his muscles and bones, as if the poison sought out the strength in him only to consume it. He tore at the robe, but it clung to him. The fabric fused to his skin as if it had grown there. The more he struggled, the more it burned. His cries carried across the mountains, echoing back from the cliffs, until even those who had once feared him felt the weight of his suffering. The hero who had wrestled death in the underworld could not escape the slow, consuming death that now wrapped him like a shroud. It was then, in the fullness of his pain, that he knew the mortal part of him was ending. The poison did not relent. It clung to Heracles as a second skin, sinking deeper with each heartbeat, threading itself into his sinews, his marrow, his very breath. There was no corner of his body it did not touch, and in time, there was no moment without pain. Even in sleep, when exhaustion forced his eyes closed, the agony remained, a constant smoldering presence beneath his ribs. His skin blistered and tore, and where the venom had fused cloth to flesh, the two had become indistinguishable, as if the robe had been part of him from the beginning. The strength that had carried him through his labors, the power to wrestle lions, drag giants to the ground, hold the weight of the sky, now turned against him, for it gave him the endurance to suffer longer than any mortal could bear. He wandered in this state until at last he came to the slopes of Mount Oeta. The mountain rose sharply from the earth, its slopes pale with rock and sparse with pine, its summit often lost in a thin veil of cloud. Here, surrounded by the stillness of the high air, he understood that there would be no healing, no return to the life he had known. This was the terminus of the mortal thread in him, and there was only one way to meet it on his own terms. He ordered a great pyre to be built, logs laid high in a careful, rising stack, their ends cut clean so the fire would take quickly. The wind at that height carried the scent of the resin in the wood, sharp and clear. Those who had followed him stood at a distance, uncertain. They had seen him triumph in 100 impossible trials, but this was something different. There was no foe to strike down, no riddle to solve, no beast to cage. This was a surrender, and yet not a defeat. The hero climbed onto the pyre himself, carrying the bow and arrows that had been his companions in so many labors. He lay down upon the unlit wood as though settling into a bed, the sky above him a bright, pitiless blue. He waited for someone to light the flame, but those gathered below hesitated. None wished to be the one to end the life of Heracles, even at his own command. It was then that Philoctetes, the son of Poeas, stepped forward. Whether out of loyalty, pity, or the recognition that a hero should meet his end without lingering in agony, he took the torch and set it to the base of the pyre. The fire caught quickly, racing upward in a dry hiss, the smoke climbing in thick coils toward the open sky. The heat rose around Hercules, and the venom's fire within him met the fire of the wood, the two burning together until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. In the old telling, it is here that the mortal body of Hercules was consumed, the flesh and bone given to the flames, but his spirit did not follow the path of other men into the shadowed halls of Hades. As the smoke curled higher, it did not disperse into the air but seemed to gather and rise, carrying with it the essence of the hero. The air above the pyre thickened with light, not the red of the fire but a pale gold-white radiance that expanded until the summit of Mount Oeta seemed bathed in it. From within that light came a presence, swift, unshaken, and it was Athena who received him, her hand extended. She lifted him as though he were weightless, the mountain and its fire falling away beneath them, the air giving way to the clear, star-pierced vault above. He did not pass into the realm of the dead, nor linger at its gates. Instead, Athena bore him upward to Olympus itself, the home of the gods, where his father Zeus awaited. There, in the high and undying air, the mortal part of Hercules was shed like a worn garment, leaving only the divine. His strength was now without limit, his body no longer bound by the decay of time or the wounds of battle. Hera herself, whose hatred had shaped so much of his life, was said to have been reconciled to him, granting him her daughter Hebe as wife. From then on, Hercules sat among the deathless, no longer a man but a god, honored in both realms, worshipped on earth as the greatest of heroes, and in heaven as one who had endured beyond the measure of mortal flesh. His image stood in temples, his name spoken in oath and prayer, his labors remembered not only for their impossible feats, but for the long road they marked, the road from the cradle struck by serpents to the pyre on Mount Oeta, from the deepest agony of the poisoned robe to the unshadowed light of Olympus. He had been mortal, and that part of him had died in the flames, but the rest of him, the part forged in trial and unyielding will, had become eternal.